Are you looking to connect to other Overwatch players just like you? Be in the know with the latest news around the game and the league? You're in the right place. Welcome to Overwatch Recall, connecting you with Overwatch podcasts. With your host, Glen Totemlydrunk Smiddy.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Overwatch Recall, connecting you with Overwatch podcasts and content creators. I am your host, Glen, Totemlydrunk Smiddy, and tonight I am joined by Snowy from the Weekly Uprising, which is a Boston Uprising Overwatch League podcast, and if you couldn't figure that out just based on the title, well, this might be a long episode for you, but anyways, I am joined by Snowy. Snowy, thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to sit down and talk all about your podcast and a little bit about the Boston Uprising and what has already been a very emotional start of the season for you guys.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride so far, and I don't think it's going to stop anytime soon.
So with that being said, let's quickly take a look back at who you are as a gamer. So when I've been doing these interviews, I always want to try to get a gauge of, one, if you are a Blizzard fan to begin with, like if you played prior Blizzard titles, and then kind of like jump into how you first got interested in playing Overwatch. Because what's been interesting is there are a lot of content creators out there that aren't traditional Blizzard fans, and then others that have kind of been like diehards. So where do you kind of fit into that category?
Yeah, I would say that I've always been, familiar with Blizzard titles, right? Had a lot of friends that played WoW and StarCraft, and always had a lot of respect for the games they put out. But Overwatch was my first as an actual player.
Man, that's crazy to think about. So it seems like it's 50-50 at this point in regards to when people actually got started. So with that being said, what was it about Overwatch that really drew your interest?
Yeah, I mean, I saw the announcement trailer just like everybody else. I kind of got hooked, right? And immediately liked the characters, liked the design, liked the idea of kind of an FPS sort of game with lore and a story. And we haven't maybe gotten quite as much of that as I anticipated, but it was definitely a hook initially. And the timing worked out really well. I hadn't really been playing many FPS games since Halo 4 sort of broke my heart. And Overwatch definitely filled that void for me.
And it's crazy, too, because Overwatch really kind of combined different subgenres within one. Because I know, in my case, I hadn't really played an FPS game since Halo 2. So, like, that's a huge gap for both of us in that sense. So, looking back, when did you first actually start playing Overwatch? Did you get into the closed beta, or was this something that you started, around when the game actually came out with its launch?
Yeah, so I remember I actually bought the game a little after launch, was busy with other stuff, and then was in grad school at the time. And so actually was on a student kind of schedule, had time to start playing games again, and got into it right around, I think, season 4 of Comp was when I started playing. I was a Mei main for a little while there, which didn't pan out so well. But it was fun. It was a cool game, a lot of kind of easy replayability, right? As opposed to Halo or TF2 or some of those other games. If I was tilted or I was getting frustrated with comp, there was quick play, and then eventually there was the arcade. And it's great that there's so many different ways I can approach it, right? If I'm serious, if I want to like climb ladder, I can do that. If I just want something casual or I want to insta-lock Widow and play around, I can do that. If I want to play Mystery Heroes and just say, I'm just going to play this game and have fun, that's an option too.
Yeah, not to mention you can even kind of create your own way of playing as well, just due to the game browser as well. So you get a little bit of everything here. So we know that you do an Overwatch League specific podcast. Well, granted, it's team specific, which is always a unique twist on it. And as someone that plays a ton of Overwatch, how do you feel like that has kind of helped you when it comes to viewing the game as an esport? Because I know a lot of people out there have a really hard time trying to get engaged with the esports side of things when it comes to viewing it, because it's a little bit fast-paced, there's a lot going on, but luckily we've kind of had a couple more tools come out since the early days of the game. But how do you really see your gameplay experience affecting you as an esports observer?
Yeah, I think that if you've played the game and you're kind of familiar with it, and certainly, I play a ton of Mystery Heroes, right? So I've got some baseline familiarity with the whole roster. I think that certainly helps. I have a good sense of like, all right, these are the abilities of this hero. These are situations where, you'll see this player making a move, that player making a move. I think that the broadcast team has certainly done a really good job of making it maybe feel a little bit less kind of twitchy and fast paced. And I think a big part of that is like, the third person perspectives, the overlays. If it was just, the POV was on a tracer the whole game and you're just zipping around back and forth, it's going to cause motion sickness. People aren't going to be super into that. But I think that, I think Overwatch, I have no idea kind of if this was part of the initial design and process and way that Blizzard was thinking about it, but I think it makes for a great and really accessible esport. You've got a super diverse cast of characters. It's not a super bloody or gory game. There's no way that, some video games that I've loved playing would ever make it, onto Disney, for example. But Overwatch has kind of crossed that barrier as an esport into nudging its way kind of more into mainstream, which has been awesome to watch.
Man, what I would give to see like Mortal Kombat 11 tournaments being streamed on Disney, that would be fantastic, but that'll never happen.
Yeah, maybe less Disney XD and more like Disney Triple X, like some extreme crossover with HBO or something.
Well, who knows? I mean, Disney just buys everything, so, HBO might be on the docket at some point.
Yeah, give it time.
Well, with that being said, obviously Overwatch League is really different from a lot of other esports leagues or just titles that we have seen in the past. Now, with that being said, like, have you followed any other esports scenes? And if so, how do you feel like Overwatch has kind of compared to some of these other titles?
Yeah, so Overwatch League is actually my first esport, so there's not a ton kind of on the esports side of things to compare it to. But just from my perspective, like a lot of people, I've been kind of a traditional sports fan for a long time, and so getting into an esport like Overwatch League, it's been really interesting and really different in a lot of cool ways, right? Like we were talking about this on the podcast a few weeks back. Like you wouldn't see there's no like patch change in like football or soccer, right? Like you
Right.
maybe get one significant rule update like a decade. But with, an esport, right, something that's kind of based on a video game, they're balancing it, they're changing it, they're making tweaks that the teams that are playing at the professional level have to keep adjusting and improvising and making new strategies. And it's been really fascinating to watch. Combine all that with the fact that you can stream it all online for free. It's magic. And the POV stuff, like I was talking about with All Access, is awesome.
Yeah, I was really curious to see whether or not the player point of view was going to be similar to what we got with the Overwatch World Cup viewer, in the sense that that was kind of its own standalone client, and of course we saw that the player point of view now is all tied behind the All Access Pass. And if you guys, for whatever reason, don't have the All Access Pass and you're watching Overwatch League, one, what are you doing? Two, you need to go buy it right now because it is well worth it. The only
Oh yeah.
my only gripe is the fact that we're not able to go back and watch player point of views when it comes to the VODs. That's really the only thing kind of holding it back. Whereas with the World Cup, we could just launch the client and be good to go, regardless of if it was live or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting to see kind of how Blizzard and Twitch are approaching this. I think that, it's much harder to roll back a feature once you've made it available. It wouldn't surprise me if maybe for season 3 we get replay of the player POV VODs, but who knows? I'm just glad that I can enjoy it in real time for now.
Absolutely. So let's learn a little bit more about the content that you produce. And I first want to start off by saying, like, I actually kind of found the Weekly Uprising based on sheer luck in the fact that both of us have some fantasy Overwatch leagues on highnoon.gg, and that's how I found you guys. Because when I saw that, I was like, wait a minute. There's an Uprising podcast, and I didn't know about this? What is going on? Now, granted, I know you guys still are relatively new in the sense that you guys began here this season. But what was it about, the Overwatch League or just, Boston Uprising in general that made you want to create a podcast tailored around that?
Yeah, so kind of tying back to, when I was in grad school, a buddy sort of half jokingly, half seriously sent me an open job position at Blizzard for like an Overwatch League, like marketing and analytics position. And that was the first time that I sort of seriously thought, wow, like this has always been like a passion of mine, always been a hobby of mine. Like this could be a career path or something I do more seriously and get involved in. Um, And that specific job didn't work out, but it definitely triggered a passion to do more. And I've always loved building stuff. I've worked on apps, websites, stuff like that, and been a podcast listener forever, but never thought that I would make that leap into actual, content creation this way. But it's been a lot of fun.
So with that being said, has this been like your first foray into podcasting?
Yeah, so I've been listening to, podcasts for a long time. I remember trying to get my friends to listen to Serial and be like, "No, it's cool. It's like a radio show, but it's on your phone and you can listen to it whenever." And that was a whole new concept. But it's been really cool to see, the platform grow, more apps coming out. I follow the industry a little bit, and Spotify's gone on like a shopping spree lately for podcasting studios. Maybe OLN is next, who knows? But it's been great seeing, podcasting as a platform grow, the people that listen to podcasts growing. And I think that my thoughts on creating like an Overwatch League and a Boston Uprising focused podcast kind of ties back to just Boston itself, right? Like I live here now. It's great. Been following the Uprising since season 1, and Boston has a really kind of rich history and a rich legacy in like sports radio and those kind of talk shows and ESPN type of things that have been around here forever. And I wanted to keep that going with a new sport or esport.
Awesome. Well, that will answer one of my future questions, but that will not pertain to you specifically now. I'm just going to cater it towards the people that you have on the podcast in itself. But with that being said, when you first got off the ground, how did you go about finding the co-hosts that you do have each week on the Weekly Uprising?
Yeah, so obviously it's not just me monologuing for 30 minutes every week. It's me, it's Space, it's Danny, and Kool-Aid. Space was the first one that I reached out to. On the Uprising subreddit last year, he did some great kind of analyses. He had sort of a skin for every win, where he'd buy a new skin for a different hero after every time the Uprising won, and a lot of really good kind of analysis and a definite understanding of the game that I enjoy it, but he had a much more insight into it. So I brought him on board. He mentioned that he'd tried to do something in season 1 with Danny and Kool-Aid, and so we brought them on as well, and it's been great. The 4 of us, sometimes it's all 4, sometimes schedules get in the way, it's only maybe 2 or 3 of us, but it's a lot of fun recording with these guys.
Yeah, definitely having 4 people on a podcast can feel a little bit like a crowd. I know I've been dealing with that, and I know, like, as I mentioned pre-show, like, we use BeLive, and something that I have noticed whenever we're doing OWL by the numbers, the one that we have 4 people on, is, for whatever reason, my webcam frame tends to bug out where it looks like I'm in big head mode, and it only happens when there's 4 of us on the show. I don't know why.
Nice.
But definitely moderating, with different dynamics in regards to like how many co-hosts you have on a podcast drastically changes with the more people you have on. So it's kind of hard to like keep the podcast on the rails in a sense the way. And I have to say, like, we have seen kind of a pretty good mixture of Overwatch League content really hitting the podcatchers, whether it's just general Overwatch League, someone that's trying to work a little bit more in regards to the analysis, or even having team-specific podcasts out there, because this is not something that is new this season. We did have a couple of other team-specific podcasts here last year, but that dynamic has always kind of interested me. So how do you feel like the typical episode format is different when you kind of compare it to just like a general Overwatch League show?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways that the Weekly Uprising is a little different. So one thing that I enjoy with kind of having that larger group of hosts is just more variation in opinions, right? 2 of us, if it was just 2 of us doing the show and we happen to agree on something, that's sort of the end of the discussion. But with 4 people, there's a really good chance that maybe someone makes a counterpoint, maybe someone just flat out disagrees, and it kind of keeps the conversation going in a really interesting way. The show that's always sort of in the back of my head when I'm thinking about this and editing episodes and trying to put together like a game plan is Around the Horn on ESPN, where I try to take a similar sort of role and kind of, I'll have opinions, I'll weigh in on things, but for the most part, I try to kind of play that host role and keep the conversation sort of guided and moving and flowing in a way that, makes sense and will be kind of enjoyable to listen to, and let these really smart, super knowledgeable people kind of just lead the way.
Yeah, that's a great example too, because we have seen podcasts out there, ourselves included, where we try to incorporate things that we kind of would see on ESPN. And I think there's a lot to be learned kind of from just sports radio or just sports, like news type TV shows. And some of the stuff doesn't always necessarily translate well to an audio format, but some of the stuff has really worked out well. And I really like kind of taking that approach where, you're not necessarily always chiming in, but you're more directing the traffic. And that definitely helps with the flow with the overall show, just because with so many people on, you need to make sure that everyone is going to have an opportunity to really be able to find their voice in a sense. And if you're just chiming in on everything, things get a little bit too chaotic at times for sure. So with that being said, I know you mentioned that you are local to Boston. Is that true about the co-host that you have on the Weekly Uprising as well?
So I'm actually the only one local to like Boston proper. The rest of the guys live a little bit further north. But it's been good. We've got plans to meet up at some point in person this season, which will be a lot of fun. Maybe get them down here for a watch party or something. Maybe I'll head up north and check out one of the gaming bars they go to. We'll see.
Awesome. Well, with that being said, let's talk about the Boston Uprising. So there's a ton that we could talk about. Boston has quite a bit of history. Not all of it. Some of it's darker than other bits, especially in season 1, and even this.
The roster changes.
In even to an extent, there's kind of an eye-rolling thing, at least in regards to the owner. But let's first start by talking about Uprising Academy. Now, I don't know if you really follow the Tier 2 scene, but Boston Uprising is one of the Overwatch League teams that does have an affiliate team, and they are competing in Contenders North America. Do you actively follow the Uprising Academy since you are a Boston Uprising fan, or is it just something that you just kind of keep an eye on, but you don't necessarily, follow week to week?
Yeah, so in my case, I don't follow the Academy personally, but that's what I've got Danny for. Danny has actually started following the Contender stuff and the Academy stuff much more closely. And I'm hoping that maybe between stages, maybe a week where there's only one match, we'll do a deep dive on kind of the Uprising Academy and cover that stuff. But I haven't followed it personally yet now.
Okay, yeah, because in regards to like the Contenders level, like we don't necessarily always see just players transitioning from the Contenders affiliate team straight to the main roster. Sometimes we see that happen, sometimes people trade for those players. So it doesn't seem to be super consistent in the sense that it's always going to be call-ups. And I do like that you did mention watch parties. I don't know, what the Boston esports scene is, because obviously I'm not local, but have you attended any watch parties, or do you know kind of like what the general vibe is in regards to esports in the city?
Oh yeah, I mean it's just like any other kind of sport, right? Boston people are going to get rowdy and hang out at a bar together. It's going to be great. I was fortunate to go to the kickoff party that we hosted. That was sort of like an official Uprising party at I think Hard Rock Cafe. Spent all of season 1, really far away from any kind of Overwatch League community or activity. So it's great to be in Boston where this stuff is going on. And it's definitely a super passionate community. I know that, Val and some of the Discord folks have worked on and put together. There's like a weekly watch party at Boston Sports Grill that I'm hoping to get to a few times this season. So definitely an active and kind of IRL community of fans. It's not just all online. It's not just Discord. People get together, they drink and have a good time watching the team.
Yeah, and I know there are quite a few teams out there that have been building that sort of localization where we see a lot of like fan groups starting to pop up. Are there any Uprising specific like fan groups that have popped up here since season 1?
I don't know about any specific fan groups. I know on the Discord there, people have, kind of a crush or like a favorite player or something like that. Which, if you're an Uprising fan, has been somewhat devastating if your favorite player was Striker, Neko, Gamsu, or whoever. But it's good. It's a good group of folks.
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of movement in regards to like the players going from season 1 to season 2, and to basically bring in new talent. We have kind of noticed that Boston has seemingly embraced kind of like this buy low mentality when it comes to signing these players. And they were kind of looking at some of these regions that are less represented in the Tier 1 scene for Overwatch. Now, that includes like Alamon, who was in South America. They got Color Hex, who was competing in Australia. And I want to kind of get your take on that sort of approach when it comes to building a roster, as opposed to, say, going out and spending, big money on who would be considered like maybe a more hotly contested free agent, similar to kind of like what the LA Gladiators had done to sign Decay from Condu Panthera.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot to be said for kind of scouting and the complexity behind that. We've talked a little on the show about trying to take this like Moneyball approach, right? Of like the Uprising having this key insight into undervalued players. But the truth is there just aren't a ton of stats out there yet. The game isn't really old enough yet to have that sort of approach fully fleshed out. I think that, because it's still early, unless you're signing an entire org like Cloud9 or Runaways and paying a lot of money for an individual superstar seems like a big risk, right? The meta could shift, their hero pool could become less relevant. Meanwhile, I think that, Huck and the team have done a really good job finding newer or relatively unknown players, or as you mentioned, players from regions that maybe don't get the spotlight as much, that are able to work really well together and adapt quickly. It's a Boston team, right? So the comparison to Belichick and the Patriots is definitely going to be made. But I think that so far the Uprising have done a really good job with it.
Absolutely. And, we kind of saw them go out and, you guys got 2 new DPS players this season. You have Blase, you have Color Hex, who are coming from contenders here this past season. And I know a lot of question marks were kind of put on Boston just due to the fact that they had kind of these untested DPS for their DPS duo, and they didn't have any sort of like backup or like huge DPS star on that lineup. So I want to get your thoughts on where you would rank Blase and Color Hex compared to some of the other DPS duos in the league. Does that like untested like mentality like weigh into your back of your mind, or are you confident that they could really step up to the plate and contest with some of the best DPS duos in the league right now?
Yeah, I think it's hard to judge Blase and Color X in the current meta. I think Blase is doing a decent enough job on Brig, but it's clear, especially if you follow him on Twitter, that he's playing her reluctantly. Meanwhile, you see him kind of practicing or playing Doomfist or some other hero that he enjoys, and it's clear that he's got a lot of talent. And I think I'm optimistic at least that that'll translate well, if and when the meta shifts. Color Hex, I think, has been a good addition, but I'm not sure that he's been the kind of like magical saving grace that people anticipated. I think one thing, while he's playing Zarya, at least in the current meta, he has to work on his survivability, right? It reminds me a bit of Kellex last season where, it's first in the feed, like first to go down. I think the casters keep mentioning like teams only win 5% of team fights where the Zarya dies first, and we're not the Vancouver Titans. So it's definitely something that I think we're going to have to work on, at least through kind of end of stage 1 and probably even after the patch hits, early stage 2 before teams have started really feeling comfortable shifting to different hero pools. After that point, a little bit, who knows, right? I think that I'm concerned we don't have like a top tier Widow or something like that. And, obviously there are some very proven DPS duos in the league from season 1 that, I think would clearly rank really well, but we're just going to have to see. And Boston does a good job adapting. And so I think we're going to have to fall back on that and have faith.
Yeah, Color Hex to me is another one of those cases where it's pretty evident that he is not a Zarya player. Now, granted, a lot of the DPS players who are normally playing like Tracer have kind of transitioned over to that Zarya role, and it's very reminiscent of some of the struggles that we have seen with players like Kari from the LA Valiant, like Soon, who's on Paris Eternal. Like, you can definitely see the struggles that some of them are having to play in that new role, as opposed to having, say, a Zarya specialist or someone that has a very high mechanical skill, because that's why Sinatra and like DeFran have been just really standing out kind of amongst the pack. So, you have these players that are either struggling with their overall tracking, or maybe their bubble management has kind of taken its toll on them, where it's really punishing them if their timing is off, where they're not just having that survivability, or they're not getting a similar type of energy gain when you compare them to some of the upper echelon Zaryas in the league. But I have to say, like, we talk about the TPS in the league, and I don't know if you got to see Jane's most recent pro pugs that they did on the PTR, but Blase was playing a ton of Doomfist, and it was clear as day. Like, out of everyone that was into pro pugs, he was the standout player. So I don't know if you got a chance to see that, but Blase seems to kind of be like the superstar in the making, so who knows? A lot of people kind of value where Boston is as a team, and that was true in Season 1 as well. And it seems like we've had a very similar trajectory in both Season 1 and already kind of like the start of Season 2 so far. And I want to get your thoughts on kind of like how the community is kind of ranked where Boston is as opposed to maybe like where you feel they are right now.
Yeah, I think that, one thing that I've seen come up again and again in Season 2 is that you've got Vancouver Titans and NYXL. It's still clearly kind of the top of the pack, right? And at the bottom, you've got Washington Justice and maybe LA Valiant, which is surprising. But besides that, it really is, a fairly evenly matched league. There's a lot of teams that any team can beat any team, right? And if you're doing like a fantasy pick'em, it'll break your heart, but it's been really enjoyable and entertaining as a fan. Just knowing that, the expression in football, right, is like, this is why they play. Any given Sunday, any team can win. And it's definitely been true kind of with that large clump of teams in the middle of the pack. I think for Boston, something that, me and I know a lot of the community are hoping for is that given time, once we adjust, once the meta shifts, whatever you want to kind of attribute it to, we're going to slowly emerge near the top of that kind of middle clump, right? And I think that there's definitely the potential for that, but it's just hard to say. I've been following the Uprising more closely than their teams, and it could be that depending on all the subtle tweaks, maybe someone on Gladiators is like a Batiste, star, and that totally shifts and changes the meta in a way that maybe we have a hard time adapting to. Maybe we pick up really quickly. It's hard to say, but comfortably, ranking them average or above average for sure. And I think we do have the potential to be like a top 5 stage playoff making team.
What's great too is I 100% agree. Like, it's clearly, NYXL, Vancouver, and then basically the rest of the league.
Mm-hmm.
But like, it's so strange kind of like seeing some of these teams that a lot of us had a lot of stock value in, like the Gladiators, who struggled really early and they finally seem to be returning to form. And yet we have the Valiant, who I'll be honest, I have the Overwatch League up muted on my TV right now, and Valiant should have won today against the Houston Outlaws. It went to, they were tied 1-1 going into map 4, which was on Route 66, which was Houston's worst map, and it was same case last season. And Houston ended up winning. So it's just like, it's been one of these seasons where it's really hard to understand what is going on with every team. Every team.
I remember I was watching the Valiant Fusion match. I guess it was earlier this week, and just something just seems off about that team in a way that I think is surprising. Something about their communication, or like the camera would cut to the players, and there'd be some tension there that you could sort of pick up on.
Right.
And obviously, I'm sure there's more to it, or maybe less to it, and I'm reading too much into it. But it makes me appreciate one thing. I think the Uprising does well and has always done well is they do have a very strong sense of teamwork, right? They've got some clear shot callers that are very effective at communicating, and seeing them, hang out on stage or outside of the match, they look like they're all having fun together, which is great.
Absolutely. And in Boston's case, they've had their ups, they've had their downs, but they have had a level of consistency to their performances as opposed to like showing up one week and then just kind of falling flat on their face the next week, which we've seen from some other teams. So at least you kind of have a general idea or understanding of kind of what to expect when they are stepping on stage. Now, looking back, we got to talk about what some might see as like the blemish so far of the season for Boston Uprising, and that was the there were two things that we're going to be talking about because these kind of go hand in hand. For one, we kind of had the situation where Fusions, who is on a 2-way contract, was basically told, hey, you're not actually able to play this game, and that game was against the Shanghai Dragons, where Shanghai Dragons were able to pick up their first win in Overwatch League history. I am just curious, as an Uprising fan, how much flack have you guys gotten, not only just as a Uprising podcast, but just as an Overwatch fan when it comes to the community? Like, have they been really like latching on to that, or has it been a little bit more quieter than what you would have expected?
Yeah, I mean, the quick answer is not as much flack, as you'd expect, right? I think that the Fusion situation was unfortunate. And you can literally, if you go back and watch, he's literally set up his like peripherals, his mouse and keyboard when they tell him like, JK, LOL, you've got to like sit out of this one. So I do wish that the Uprising had been given a little more notice or had a little more time to kind of prep. But with all due respect to Shanghai, I think there's a chance they would have won anyway. You know, Gamsu kind of filling in as main tank for them, I think was really a key component that the team needed to do well. And it's basically a whole new team this year. So on the one hand, right, it feels bad to have the L against quote unquote the Shanghai Dragons, but I think they're a really good team this year. I think, you know, like I was saying before, they're definitely in that kind of middle of pack group. And there's no shame in losing to a good team like that.
It's crazy to think too. Like basically at a point now where Dragons really are an entirely new team in the sense that we haven't necessarily been seeing the season 1 players that were on that roster playing that many maps anymore. They've kind of just gone that Kondu Panthera or Shangdu Dranthera, as we call them on Owl Network, roster, and they seem to be doing pretty good outside of them. What honestly were 2 games that they should have won against Dallas Fuel. They were clearly throwing yesterday, but it's definitely been an interesting team to follow.
Yeah, and I picked them against London in the pick'em this week, and that was something I never thought I would do in one.
So looking at Fusions, I have to say Fusions has really been like one of the sweet spots of this team because he's brought like this level of aggression on that front line, and the Reinhardt play has been very entertaining to watch. So I want to get your thoughts on what you feel like his presence has brought to the team.
Yeah, I think that, you know, Fusions is a really talented player, and we've seen him play kind of Winston and some other tanks from time to time, but fortunately the current meta really favors, I think, an aggressive Reinhardt, and he is arguably like top of the league as far as that goes. It's super entertaining to watch. I think it's very motivating as a team to kind of follow a Reinhardt into battle, but one thing that I like most is he's taken on a really active shot calling role in a way that I don't think I would have expected from a new member of the team. Mm-hmm. And, you know, hearing his post-game interviews, his voice is always really hoarse. He's really into and it's just great to see somebody coming in, you know, relatively fresh, right? You know, he was in the World Cup. He did extremely well, right? But there's a difference between that and kind of the consistency of Overwatch League and week after week, you know, getting on stage in front of fans that sometimes are rooting for you, sometimes are rooting against you. And can you handle that? And I think he's done an amazing job.
Absolutely. And, you know, this is definitely a team who doesn't necessarily have like the most backups at some of these positions. So with that in mind, do you feel like Boston are going to be buyers during the mid-season sign-in window? Like, is there anyone out there in particular that you would like to see either be called up from the Uprising Academy or for them to sign as, you know, a free agent at some point this season?
Yes, all right. So I think that it definitely wouldn't surprise me if they called up some of the folks from the Academy team, but, you know, like you said, the call-up route isn't necessarily as clear-cut. Broadly speaking, I would sort of expect the team to make at least a couple of acquisitions, and I think part of that will depend on what does the meta look like by mid-season. You know, will there be enough time for the patch to have hit and for teams to have adjusted and for the Uprising to really recognize what gaps in our hero pool might look like? I think that last season we signed Aim God, which has proven to be a very good acquisition, especially if you've got him on your fantasy roster. But I don't know. It seemed to me like season 1, the sort of buy low and maybe stack up on supports and only buy, you know, pick up one support in mid-season. It felt like a very conservative sort of team management strategy to me. And I'd like to think that in season 2, now that Overwatch League has been proven a little bit more, the organization will be willing to invest a little bit more into it and maybe make a couple more pickups.
Absolutely. So taking a look at Uprising and their overall performance this season, as of recording this interview, the Uprising are currently 2-3 with a -2 map differential. So you have 2 more matches this stage. You face Florida Mayhem up next, and then you close out the season against the Dallas Fuel. So I want to kind of get your take on your remaining matches and where you think Boston is basically going to rank at the end of the stage. So I know for Mayhem, you know, they very recently went out and signed McGravy as a flex tank who was playing on Team Envy, which is the Dallas Fuel Academy team. And we started seeing see new signs of life, really, from the mayhem. So are you kind of approaching this game as maybe a sort of trap game for the Boston Uprising?
Yeah, I think that there's always the risk that it's a trap game, right? And I think especially with a team where you've got sort of this impression, especially if you don't follow the whole league consistently, you have this impression in your mind from season one, right? And it's, Shanghai is this, Dallas is that, Florida is this. Um, that said, I'm still fairly confident in the Uprising beating Florida. I think Dallas could be a more interesting match. It could be a little closer, but I'm really hoping that we can 4-0 or at least 3-1 Florida. And, we need to if we want to stand any chance of making the stage one playoffs. As far as rating their stage one performance across the board, I think we saw, a hiccup with the fusion situation that seems to be resolved now. Color Hex has been playing with the team a little bit longer now. I think they're definitely trending upwards for sure. And ultimately, I think we're not going to make the stage one playoffs. It's a bummer to say, but I think that's the case. But I don't think we're going to miss the cutoff by much, maybe 1 or 2 positions.
And it's worth noting, too, like, when it comes to the overall playoff format, once we get towards the season playoffs, something that's new this year is the fact that, we got the stage finals in, stage 1, 2, and 3. There's no stage finals at the end of stage 4. What they're doing is for those 7th through 12th ranked teams in the Overwatch League, they're going to have a play-in tournament where basically, like, it's just like a second chance to actually make the season playoffs. So this is what, I dub, like, the Seoul Dynasty tournament, because, we basically saw them basically crap the bed pretty much throughout the entire Golden Knocker season, which I hate to say because that's one of my teams. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely been something that I feel like is needed, especially when you consider, like, how close a lot of these teams are, because it is a lot more, like, even kill throughout the league at this point now that we have 20 teams. So how do you feel like that's going to help Boston? Just because they have kind of seemed to be one of these teams that are kind of, like, on the bubble, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, if season one proved anything, it's that while the league didn't have quite as much parity last season, Philadelphia Fusion came in and made it to the finals, right? And I want to say they were the last ranked team that just edged by into the playoffs. So that kind of proves this idea that, okay, like, there's always a great underdog story. It makes for super, entertaining viewing as a fan. It's good for the league. I think that this kind of play-in sort of wild card format speaks to that as well, right? And it's going to make for entertaining, television and that kind of thing. But I also think that it is a good chance, and it's a good thing it happened this season when you do have so much parity, because you're going to see a lot of teams that end up right on that cusp, that I think you said 7 through 12, position, that get one last chance to really, like, buckle down. Like, if you haven't figured out the meta by this point, you're going to go out early. But if it took you maybe just a little longer, it's a second chance, right? And I think that that's something that we saw the Uprising struggle with last playoffs, where you had a couple of small balance changes to things. Philadelphia rolled out with a very aggressive, brawling, double sniper style that the Uprising, I think, just wasn't ready for. And being able to have this kind of second chance sort of mini tournament, I think it'll be good for the Uprising, for sure.
Yeah, and that's not even counting some of the other format changes that we saw in regards to some of the other playoffs, because I know for the season playoffs, those two also are double elimination. So you'll have the winner's bracket, you'll have the loser's bracket, so you even have, like, a second chance opportunity there as well. And when it comes to, like, the stage playoffs, it's also worth noting that after that initial opening round, which is a round of 8, since, we kind of saw an expansion there, they're basically reseeding the bracket after that opening round as well. So it's going to offer, like, a lot more dynamic in regards to the actual playoff matches that we'll be able to see. And, by the looks of it right now, I mean, it's pretty much looking like it's going to be Titans versus NYXL. But
which will be great, because I think they don't face each other in the regular season until, like, the last week or something. So I want to see that matchup sooner rather than later. And I'm hoping we see it in the stage 1 playoffs.
Absolutely. So with that in mind, Boston is a huge sports city. And of course, with sports, we have rivalries. Now, I know, maybe some things have kind of evolved over time, But out of the teams in the Overwatch League, who do you feel like would be the Boston Uprising rivals? Are you just going to go straight to New York? Are you going to go for someone that might have maybe a bit of a redemption arc to it from like former players or anything like that?
Yeah, I think you're on the same wavelength as me. I really want to say New York because that's such a classic sports rivalry, and I think that's not entirely without merit, right? I think we beat them last season a couple times, and our first match against them was, I think, surprisingly close. But I think the more honest answer right now is that it feels like Toronto. There's a weird history there with our original contenders team, kind of Toronto Defiant coming in, and definitely with Neko as well. And I think that it's two teams that run goats at about the same level of skill. I think we're fairly evenly matched. They beat us once this season. I'm hoping that when we rematch, we win against them. But to me, that feels like a more natural kind of maybe northeastern rivalry that's brewing.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought up Toronto esports because I remember covering that story and just how quickly that team kind of imploded. It's just like it was one of the strangest things that I have seen in Overwatch, whether it is at a tier 3, tier 2, or tier 1 level. It's just not something you would expect to see at. It was definitely one of the more like buzzworthy like headlines that we got to see here, probably within like the last 6 months, I would say even. But it's just I love the fact that in some instances when it comes to these rivalries, it's not all necessarily just based on rivalries that we see outside of the Overwatch League. Obviously, with baseball and football, New York versus Boston is always going to be one of the hotly rival type games. And something that I would love to see with Overwatch League is for them to just do like a rivalry night where all of the matches for one day are marquee matches in that sense, and just kind of help build them up a little bit more, because we've kind of gotten to this point now this season where we have seen some teams, or maybe some players specifically, who have been elevating the amount of trash talk that we have been seeing. I remember, I believe it was Dogman who was shouting basically at the arena crowd about a particular player throwing, or we've seen Jonak during his interviews basically call people out, Bumper saying like, hey, Titans are just gonna 4-0 everyone, which hasn't happened, but Titans, needless to say, have still been doing fairly well, seeing as they haven't.
It's not bragging if it's true when it comes to the Titans.
So I kind of want to get your thoughts on what that sort of talk has brought to the Overwatch League this season, as opposed to maybe some of the things we saw last season.
Oh, it's just been great, right? And I think that it's so cool to me to see Overwatch League as an esport, and the way that it's just being an esport, right? Like the elements of traditional sports that I love that are really starting to come out, rivalries that are happening organically within the league between teams, and not just, like you said, like I think they try to push, maybe nudge like a Boston New York sort of rivalry, but it's a little there, it's not really there. Other things like, no disrespect, I know they're your team, but Dynasty versus New York, like that's not a matchup I'm really excited by. I know who's going to win that.
I mean, so do I.
It's been great, and you're starting to see these natural organic rivalries emerge, whether they're driven by the orgs themselves, coaches. It certainly wouldn't surprise me if Shock become more of a kind of clear rival with Striker and Krusty over there with the Uprising. But it's just awesome, and it makes for good entertainment, good esports, good television.
Absolutely, and it's crazy to just think like this season too. When it comes to like the playoffs, like we're gonna be on ABC, we're gonna be like on basic cable as opposed to just on ESPN that not every household is going to have. So I kind of want to get your thoughts on just like the progression that we have seen when it comes to the broadcast. Like, how hyped are you to just be able to sit at home, turn on your TV, and watch what are arguably going to be some of the more marquee matches this season?
It's been amazing, right? And even, following season 1 last year, and just one thing to note, if you ever go back and look at like old VODs of the inaugural season, right? Look at who the sponsors are. I think initially it was literally like Sour Patch Kids and End of List. And now we've got Toyota, we've got Coca-Cola, for crying out loud. We've got HP and Omen have always been sponsors, but companies, I think, are starting to invest more money and attention to Overwatch League, and that's only going to help it grow, right? And the partnership with Disney and ESPN and ABC, like I said earlier in the interview, right? Overwatch to me feels like a very accessible esport. You've got a fairly diverse, cast of heroes, right? So it takes some explaining maybe to understand the nuances of, all right, well, here's why you would pick this support versus that support. Here's what this tank can do versus that tank. And I do love the little explainer videos that the casters do of like, this is what an assault map is. This is what control is. But it's great. I think that there's a few things about Overwatch League that have helped it kind of nudge more towards mainstream than maybe some other esports have in the past. And I could talk about that all day, right? You've got sort of more traditional, established sports franchise owners. You've got the company putting a lot of first party support and effort into it. You've got certainly an interesting group of people that there's aspects of it that are really appealing, right? Players are more accessible than ever before, not just the POVs and all access, but being on Discord and talking with the community and sharing that. The Twitter game that some of these, teams have is really impressive on the social side of things. So it's been super enjoyable seeing Overwatch League grow and seeing the content creator community growing around it to kind of tie it back to why we're here. And I'm looking forward to it growing even more.
What's really cool too is, like as someone that kind of dabbles into kind of all aspects of the game, we have seen. I don't know how much you pay attention to Overwatch Recall with the weekly podcast listings, but during the off season, traditionally I would say we would have anywhere from like 15 at the very low end, which was like probably only during like Christmas week or like New Year's, to on a higher end of like 2021. Weekly podcast that we're doing an episode each week. And ever since the Overwatch League started, that number has jumped significantly to the point now, right now, I think we're averaging about 30 podcasts releasing a new episode every week since the league started. And it's crazy to see just how much interest the Overwatch League kind of drums up within the community, because we've kind of seen things, at least with the game side. People have a lot of issues with the current rank system. We have these major changes that are on the PTR that are going to impact the game at every level, basically. And, we could see the potential introduction of role queue, and we might, maybe we'll get some of the community back that we've possibly lost to other games that have come out lately, like, Apex Legends, who hit 50 million players, which is absolutely incredible. But I feel like we're getting to the point now where, Overwatch League brings some of the community back. These PTR changes are gonna, like, bring forth another wave. And it feels like we're getting back to where we were. And this is something that we're going to be able to build on. And I know for the podcast especially, Overwatch League across the board helps everyone. It just doesn't help specifically the, team-specific podcasts. It doesn't just affect the Overwatch League podcast. It trickles down to every facet of content creation, which is just so great to see. But with that being said, I need to let our listeners know, like, where can they find the Weekly Uprising? When it comes to, social media, whether or not you guys have a way to engage with the community on, like, Discord, things like that. And of course, like, what podcatchers is the Weekly Uprising on? Because I know there's like a slew of them. You could like just knock out like the major ones. You don't have to go through everyone, because I know there's like probably like close to 40 at this point. It's hard to keep track.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we are, I think, first and foremost on Twitter at Weekly Uprising. We'll post memes, we'll retweet stuff, we post links to every episode as it comes out, and a couple other fun things. As for podcatchers, every podcatcher that I know exists, I have tried to put us on. Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, et cetera, et cetera. We use SoundCloud as our host, so content's always available at soundcloud.com/Weekly Uprising. If you, for whatever reason, don't want to use a podcast app that's already installed on your phone, or if you're on a desktop, or there's an easier way for you to listen. And yeah, I'm in the Boston Uprising Discord. We're also, fairly active from time to time on Reddit and a couple other places, and we welcome feedback. We're all doing this sort of for the first time. We have a lot of passion for it, but we want to hear kind of what people think and constructive feedback, right? Is 20 to 30 minutes too short? Is it too long? Is weekly good? Do you want an episode for every match? That kind of thing. So yeah, would love to hear what people think. Would love for them to engage with us, tweet at us, whatever. It's great.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Overwatch Recall with Glen, Totemlydrunk, Smiddy. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit OWLN.